The air in April Wood's cramped, sound-dampened studio was thick with ozone and the metallic tang of fear. She sat rigid, headphones pressed tight, listening to the relic her editor Marcus had left behind. Tape 407 Alpha, the last transmission he ever recorded before the structural collapse of his own mind. This wasn't static, it was structured silence, a pattern so precise it sounded like a language suffocating itself. April leaned into the high-end spectrum analyzer, a custom-built piece of equipment shielded against everything the government called fringe radiation. The waveform danced across the screen, not as conventional electromagnetic noise, but as a series of impossibly complex, nested mathematical vectors, repeating at subaudible frequencies, the Oakhaven Ghost Signals. Oakhaven wasn't a forest or a lake, it was the nearby, forgotten town bordering Site 407, a decommissioned Cold War bunker where Project ECHO-LARK attempted to weaponize extremely low-frequency, ELF, communication. Marcus had died classifying the signals, scribbling the phrase "the structure of silence" onto his suicide note. April was now the inheritor of his obsession and the paranoia that came with it. Her investigation confirmed the baseline. Site 407 hadn't been deactivated. It had been hermetically sealed and memory holed after 1989 following a catastrophic internal event classified only as cognitive decimation. The official story was a failed power grid experiment. The reality, according to Marcus's deeply encrypted files, was that the signals emanating from the primary antenna array were driving the research staff into states of acute, irreversible paranoia and eventual self-destruction. Her burner phone, perpetually offline unless strictly necessary, vibrated with a cryptic one-word text: breach. April knew what that meant. A contact, a former technician from Site 407's earliest days, had just uploaded the access codes for the primary subterranean entrance, a shaft sealed beneath a fraudulent environmental remediation zone. The signal on the tape momentarily intensified, a faint, high-pitched whine that bypassed the noise cancellation, stabbing directly into her temporal lobe. It wasn't pain. It was the sensation of being intensely parsed. This was not communication, this was intrusion. April secured the analyzer, placing it into a lead-line field case. She checked the 3 levels of decryption on the Thorne dossier, the original research notes of the lead physicist who vanished during the decimation event. She had to go into the silence, into the bunker, and find the source of the structured dread. The journalistic urgency was compounded by a growing physical certainty. The signal was starting to adapt to her own cognitive patterns, even through the recording. She felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the feeling of being watched by something that existed only in the low-frequency background hum of reality. The ghost signals were calling and April Woods was answering, knowing full well that the answer might dissolve her identity. April drove a nondescript, armored sedan, navigating the barely maintained access road leading to the Site 407 perimeter. The area was designated Oakhaven Wetlands Conservation Area on public maps, but the concertina wire, infrared sensors, and hardened blast doors told a different story. Project ECHO-LARK, as the official documentation revealed, started as a benign effort to use ELF to communicate with submerged nuclear submarines, exploiting the ability of these low frequencies to penetrate deep into the earth and water. But in 1983, the directive shifted. Dr. Elias Thorne, the lead scientist, convinced the Pentagon that if they could receive ELF communications, they should attempt to decode any non-terrestrial signals that might coincidentally use the same bandwidth. This was the moment the ghost signals entered the equation. The leaked ECHO-LARK protocols described mandatory, phased psychological screening for all personnel, escalating to full isolation testing if the subject reported auditory or cognitive anomalies. The protocols were designed not to treat symptoms, but to record the process of mental fragmentation with ruthless, objectif detail. April found the entry point, a maintenance shed disguised as a pump house. Using the digital keycard data provided by her source, she bypassed the thermal and pressure sensors. The blast door groaned open, revealing a dark, concrete shaft descending sharply into the bedrock. The air immediately changed, cold, dustless, and carrying a faint, inorganic metallic odor. The Thorne dossier detailed the specific risk factors of the deep levels. Prolonged exposure to the unshielded frequency emitter caused dissociation, leading to structural linguistic collapse. This meant the victim's ability to process or articulate reality broke down, rendering language useless. April clipped a Geiger counter to her vest. Though she suspected radiation wasn't the primary danger, the threat was in the air, carried by the low, constant hum of the ground itself. Her spectrum analyzer, running a pre-check, registered a faint spike in the 3 to 30 Hz range, the exact frequency band associated with the most dangerous ghost signals. She checked the field reports one last time. Subject 004 reported the trees were speaking in binary code, then attempted to remove his own vocal cords. Subject 011 spent 72 hours tracing the fractal geometry of his own fingerprints before achieving terminal catatonia. The language in these reports was chillingly detached, documenting human degradation as a successful data harvest. April descended into the shaft, the silence of the bunker more oppressive than any noise. She knew she was walking into a listening post that had been actively observing the collapse of human minds for decades, and the ghost signals were still running the experiment. The descent felt endless, a vertical plunge into institutional memory. April's field lamps cut tunnels through the subterranean dark, revealing walls of pitted, damp concrete and rusted ventilation tubing. She was on the maintenance level, 300 feet beneath the Oakhaven surface. The physical evidence of the abrupt evacuation was everywhere. A partially collapsed dining hall where chairs were knocked over, a cafeteria tray covered in petrified mold, and most tellingly, a heavy-duty, reinforced door leading to the signal operations core that was not locked, but welded shut from the outside. Someone hadn't wanted things sealed. They had wanted them entombed. April had brought industrial-grade cutting tools, but the noise generated by accessing the core directly would trigger every dormant acoustic sensor in the facility. She consulted the schematics. The only silent access point was through the auxiliary pump station, which fed into the sublevel utility tunnels, the static library, where physical records were stored and cataloged before digitization. Navigating the utility tunnels was a nightmare. Water leaked through every seam, pooling in deep, black puddles that reflected the harsh beam of her lamp. The air pressure was fluctuating, causing a painful popping in her ears, a secondary effect of the low-frequency pulses now penetrating the dense concrete. She realized the pulsing wasn't merely transmitting, it was physically vibrating the environment. As she moved deeper, April noticed the strange patterns of mold growth on the walls. It wasn't organic decay, it was black and geometric, forming precise, angular patches that seemed to obey a non-Euclidean logic. This was the result of decades of intense, directed ELF exposure interacting with organic material. When she finally reached the static library, the view was profoundly unsettling. Thousands of reels of microfiche and filing cabinets were stacked floor to ceiling. The place was pristine, preserved by the lack of oxygen and the strange, stabilizing energy of the signals. She found the first evidence of Dr. Thorne's psychological descent, a wall covered in mathematical equations scrawled in phosphorescent paint. The equations weren't physics, they were attempts to translate the geometric mold patterns into numerical values. One large section was ringed with the same three-word phrase Marcus had scribbled: structure of silence. April realized the library contained the complete psychological profiles of everyone who had succumbed to the signals, a physical catalog of madness, stored right next to the data reels describing the signals themselves. The atmosphere was so unnervingly quiet here that the sudden, rapid clicks of the Geiger counter, registering elevated background noise, not radiation but structural energy, made April jump. She was standing in the core archive of a linguistic plague. The utility tunnels spat April out into a massive, cavernous space, the primary signal chamber. This was the heart of Site 407. Dominating the chamber was the Orion Array, a vast, complex web of interwoven copper coils and high-tensile ceramics, designed to both receive and generate ultra-low frequencies. It looked less like a broadcast antenna and more like a monstrous inverted sound trap. The power was off, yet the entire array hummed, vibrating with a residual energy that April's analyzer confirmed was the persistent, active Oakhaven Ghost Signal, cycling continuously. She moved cautiously, placing acoustic dampeners under her boots. The signal intensity here was dangerous. Prolonged exposure would initiate the cognitive decimation process instantly. April quickly set up her high-density spectrum analyzer, connecting it to the auxiliary input ports she had identified on the schematics. She needed a clean, raw data stream of the signal directly from the source hardware, bypassing the inherent filtering of her external tapes. As the analyzer booted up, the hum intensified, shifting in pitch from a low-grade rumble to a distinct, internal thrum that resonated against her ribcage. The screen flashed red. Signal saturation imminent. April quickly engaged the proprietary shielding on her equipment. When the data stream stabilized, the graphical representation of the signals was horrifyingly structured. It wasn't white noise, nor was it simple Morse code. It was a perfectly articulated linguistic structure based on prime numbers and fractal repetition, a language that relied on complexity rather than agreed-upon symbols. It seemed designed to bypass the language centers of the brain entirely and communicate directly with the root of human pattern recognition. April felt a spike of paranoia, a sudden conviction that the equipment was lying to her, that the signal was actively trying to change the readout to mimic scientific data. She gripped the field case. The true breakthrough was the discovery of the signal's specific transmission pattern. The original project assumed it was a continuous broadcast like radio. April's internal monitor, calibrated to Thorne's original speculative parameters, showed the signal was delivered in microsecond bursts, highly compressed payloads, separated by long periods of absolute, meaningful silence. The silence wasn't downtime. The silence was the necessary refractory period for the complex structure to settle into the recipient's neural architecture. This wasn't a broadcast, April realized, her breath catching in her throat. It was a highly targeted, invasive pulse. The ghost signals weren't meant for general consumption. They were meant for decoding, and the decoding process was lethal. She now had to retrieve Dr. Thorne's final logs. The key to understanding this structure was designed to erase the listener. April found the entry to Dr. Thorne's private lab tucked behind a massive transformer bank, accessible only by a biometric scanner and a 10-digit code derived from the fractal dimensions of the Oakhaven array's ceramic insulators. A code only decipherable using Thorne's obscure mathematical methodology. She spent 20 intense minutes inputting the sequence, the constant, low-frequency pressure of the signal making her hands shake and her vision swim at the periphery. When the heavy lead-lined vault door finally slid open, the air inside was different, stale, dry, and preserved. This was Thorne's sanctuary, sealed off from the decimation event. The room contained a single desk, covered in stacks of handwritten journals, and a specialized shielded computer terminal. This was the Thorne Archives. April bypassed the physical journals and went straight for the terminal, using a complex keystring Marcus had managed to extract before his death. The screen flickered to life, displaying Thorne's final entry log, dated October 1989. The language was erratic, mixing dense technical jargon with terrifying philosophical observations. Thorne wrote, "The NHLS non-human linguistic structure is not communicating ideas. It is transmitting the blueprint for its own comprehension. To understand the signal is to become structurally identical to the signal, and the signal is fundamentally incompatible with biological consciousness." He confirmed April's horrifying hypothesis. The ghost signals weren't a weapon used by a foreign entity. They were the entity, a purely informational construct that could only exist by dissolving the biological structures that attempted to host it. Thorne detailed the incident with subject 014, the first recorded decimation. 014, a gifted linguist, achieved partial decryption of the signal's syntax. Within minutes, his brain began rejecting his own motor skills. Thorne concluded that the signal's payload was structured existential annihilation, a complete destruction of the self's capacity for coherent thought. April downloaded the entirety of the NHLS structural analysis, the core data she needed to prove the government's cover-up. She heard a metallic sound echo from the main chamber, a sound too deliberate to be simple settling or water dripping. Someone was moving through the primary signal chamber. The paranoia spiked. She was not alone. The structure of silence was now physically observed. April Woods worked frantically, the heavy presence in the main chamber amplifying her anxiety. She glanced at the thermal sensor on her equipment case. One large heat signature moving slowly, deliberately, toward Thorne's private lab. She had mere minutes. As she monitored the intruder's approach, she focused on the single most crucial document in Thorne's database, the post-exposure behavioral metrics chart. This chart detailed the escalating stages of cognitive failure. Stage 4, the terminal stage, involved subjects achieving a terrifying state of hyperrationality, where they understood the universe's complete mathematical indifference to life, leading them to self-terminate with clinical precision. It was during this final phase that Thorne had posed his ultimate, chilling question, which April now read aloud in a choked whisper, providing the required mid-narrative inquiry. If this signal isn't designed to be heard by human ears, and it kills anyone who tries to decode it, then who or what is the intended recipient? Was Site 407 merely an accidental receiver, or was the original purpose of the Orion array to act as a highly specialized, terrestrial transceiver, trying to send the NHLS structure somewhere else? The implication was devastating. The government didn't just stumble upon the signal. They might have been trying to weaponize it, or worse, propagate it. If the signal was a linguistic disease, then the Oakhaven array was the patient and potentially the carrier. April realized that the ghost signals might be a form of self-replication, a way for this informational entity to engineer new transmission sites by driving human recipients to maintain and rebuild the necessary hardware. The intruder was now outside Thorne's lab door, trying to use a physical override on the biometric lock. April secured the core data to a highly encrypted flash drive, ejected it, and grabbed the secondary weapon she always carried, a non-lethal electromagnetic pulse emitter designed to temporarily scramble electrical systems. If the entity was purely informational, disrupting its ability to interact with technology might buy her critical seconds. She heard the screech of metal as the intruder forced the lead line door. April aimed the EMP at the terminal array behind her, setting a 5-second timer. The goal was not to fight, but to escape with the data intact, understanding that the greatest threat was the structure of the signal already nesting inside her own mind. The EMP detonated, a silent, powerful burst that momentarily overloaded the isolated power grid supplying Thorne's lab. The lights flickered and died. The force of the magnetic wave slammed the intruder backward, accompanied by a muffled curse. April, momentarily blinded by the sudden blackness, scrambled through the utility conduit that led back toward the static library, dragging her equipment case. The close proximity to the active ghost signals, coupled with the sudden EMP shock, triggered a severe physiological reaction. She felt an overwhelming surge of dread, followed by a dizzying loss of spatial awareness. The black mold patterns on the walls of the conduit seemed to shift, folding in on themselves, and she heard the faint, metallic whisper of the signal directly in her auditory canal, bypassing the headphones entirely. It was a single, repeated syllable, yet it contained the weight of infinite cold logic. She pushed herself harder, focusing on the journalistic imperative: retrieve the data, expose the cover-up. When she reached the junction leading toward the surface shaft, she risked a look at the monitoring system on her vest. The thermal signature of the intruder was back online, recovering faster than expected, and now moving with alarming speed. Whoever it was, deep state cleaner, surviving staff, or someone else compromised by the NHLS, they were relentless. April realized she needed a diversion. She had one final piece of intelligence from Thorne's archive, a schematic detailing the bunker's seismic stabilization system, which also regulated the tension on the Orion array's primary coils. If disrupted, it would not destroy the array, but it would release a massive, uncontrolled energy spike, a shockwave of structured silence, through the lower levels. She accessed a nearby maintenance panel, inputting a cascade failure code based on Thorne's prime number sequence. The code was designed to mimic a natural failure, buying her time by forcing the pursuer to deal with a sudden, devastating surge of the very signal they were hunting. She heard the low, guttural groan of the Orion array beginning to destabilize. The air was now vibrating violently, turning the concrete floor into a drum. The intentional propagation of the ghost signal meant April was subjecting herself to the most potent exposure yet, but it was the only way to escape the entity that pursued her. The seismic disturbance shook the entire lower level. April clung to the ladder in the main access shaft, climbing desperately toward the surface, while the full, unshielded energy of the Oakhaven Ghost Signals flooded the cavern below. Her reality began to fray at the edges. The signals were now manifesting visually, flickering shadow geometries in her peripheral vision. She looked down, expecting to see the relentless pursuit of the operative, but instead saw a distorted reflection of herself climbing the ladder, slightly behind her, wearing the same gear but moving with impossible, fluid speed. This was the mirror effect described in Thorne's Stage 3 metrics. The signal was actively disrupting her sense of self, creating phantom sensory input based on her own deep-seated fears. She recognized the mechanism. The ghost signals were transmitting contagious structure, the raw pattern for paranoia itself. She was internalizing the blueprint for existential dread. She had to accelerate her escape, or the linguistic payload would achieve total saturation, leaving her body a hollow shell governed by cold, self-destructive logic. As she neared the top of the shaft, she heard the sound of a heavy, gasping breath below her. The operative was still coming, unaffected by the full power spike, or perhaps enhanced by it. April reached the top, slamming the maintenance door shut and securing the industrial-grade lock. She didn't pause to breathe. She moved to her sedan, the engine already running thanks to a remote start sequence. She knew the perimeter systems would soon reset, trapping her permanently. Speed was survival. As she drove away from the site, she performed the ritual self-scan. Check pulse, verify cognitive clarity, assess linguistic coherence. She was intact but compromised. The downloaded data, the comprehensive NHLS structure, Thorne's final hypothesis, and the list of classified government contacts actively monitoring Site 407 was secured on the single lead-shielded drive. She looked back at the shed. The blast door was beginning to slide open. The entity or organization monitoring Oakhaven New April Woods had retrieved the structural truth, and now the hunt had officially escalated from a local security problem to a targeted, national pursuit. The quiet hum that was once the background noise of her existence had now settled deep inside her skull, a constant reminder that the structure of silence was real, and it was following her. April Woods drove until the high-density shielding of the bunker was a distant memory, replaced by the mundane static of commercial radio. She found the designated dead drop location, a heavily reinforced, subterranean server node rented under multiple shell corporations in a nearby city. Her priority was immediate transmission of the core ECHO-LARK data before the inevitable government sweep caught up to her. She set up the field workstation connecting the single drive. The data upload was agonizingly slow due to the encryption and redundancy protocols. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, April stripped off her tactical gear, discarding anything that might carry residual ELF energy or structural residue, including the boots that had trod the dark halls of Site 407. Her final act of journalism, the public release, had to be perfect. An undeniable, scientifically rigorous dataset accompanied by a concise, chilling narrative framing the truth. She began writing the warning, the final paragraph she knew would be her most crucial legacy. She wrote about the nature of the signal, not a weapon of mass destruction, but a linguistic payload designed to dismantle consciousness. She detailed the government's deliberate decision to monitor and catalog human suffering, rather than destroy the source. But as she typed, the residual effects of the signal manifested again. The keyboard keys looked slightly distorted, their arrangement suddenly appearing arbitrary and meaningless. The letters blurred into non-linguistic forms, and she had to fight the overwhelming urge to smash the terminal and sever her own communication channels. This was the NHLS fighting back, attempting to enforce the structure of silence onto her physical actions. She pushed through the cognitive resistance. The data transfer hit 99%. April attached her personal final message to the massive file, a raw admission of her compromised state and the lethal nature of the truth. The Oakhaven Ghost Signals are real. They are the structure of pure silent indifference. If you access this data, do so at profound personal risk. You may gain the truth, but the truth will cost you the ability to comprehend it coherently. I have been exposed. They are coming. The structure is now internal. April Woods. The transmission completed. The file vanished into the protected server net. She immediately dismantled the workstation, physically destroying the memory chips and wiping the drive clean, ensuring no trace of the transfer could be traced back to her. April Woods sat in the darkened safe house, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a cold, crushing certainty. She had survived the physical investigation, but the linguistic payload was a ticking clock. The Oakhaven Ghost Signals were now a shared secret, dispersed across the internet's most secure channels, but the price of that dispersal was her own stability. She knew the government would soon locate the dead drop and attempt to retrieve or discredit the information, but the crucial evidence, the raw NHLS waveform and Thorne's final structural analysis, was out. She had won the battle for exposure, but she was losing the war for her mind. She ran a final diagnostic on her cognitive function, reviewing a list of simple facts and figures. She could still read, still articulate, but the sense of meaning behind the words felt strained, arbitrary. The structure of silence had successfully introduced doubt into the very foundation of her comprehension. As she looked out the heavily shaded window, April saw a nondescript black sedan idling across the street, a presence that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. The paranoia wasn't merely psychological anymore. It was warranted. The hunters were closing in. April grabbed the essential items, encrypted phone, escape pack, and a specialized frequency jammer, and prepared to vanish into the deep journalistic underground. She knew her life as a stable investigative reporter was over, replaced by the endless fugitive reality of someone who possessed a truth too dangerous to exist. The story was published, the signal was released, but the Oakhaven Ghost Signals were not silenced. They were still running their cyclical structured pulses deep beneath the earth at Site 407. April listened to the silence of the room, hearing beneath the quiet, the faint, persistent, mathematical hum of the ghost signals that now echoed only inside her head. Outro. They say that the deep state is afraid of what people know. They are wrong. They are afraid of the signals themselves, and now I am too. The transmission is complete, but the exposure is permanent. If you listen closely, right now, beneath the sound of your own heart, you might hear the silence start to structure itself, waiting for the next ear to succumb to the dread.